What does it feel like to be a broke, worthless soldier? That's what my younger sister Olivia spat at me right in the middle of our Christmas dinner. I had spent my whole youth raising that girl, and this was how she repaid me. Her husband snickered along beside her, mocking me for wasting away in some army camp, scraping by on a small pension. I just sat there, staring at the designer handbag she'd just unwrapped in the enormous house she called home. Neither of them had any clue that every inch of that luxury had been paid for with my blood, my sweat, my tears, and 15 years of my life. I wasn't furious. I set my wine glass down slowly, smiled, and said, "Then how about this? How will it feel knowing this broke soldier will never pay another one of your bills again?" The instant those words left my mouth, my sister's smile locked in place, her color draining away. Her husband's fork slipped from his hand and hit the plate with a clatter. All his smugness evaporated, replaced by something close to dread. But that was only the beginning of what was coming for them, because they had no idea I was about to make it official. Before I get into what happened next, if this story hits home for you, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? My hands clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, the tires grinding over roads slick with ice. The wipers fought a losing battle against the thickening snow, but none of it was as loud as my sister's words still echoing in my skull. Pathetic, broke soldier. That phrase kept looping, each pass cutting deeper than the one before. I'd made it through mortar fire and rough seas without flinching, but nothing in my career had ever landed like those 5 words from the one person I'd given up everything to protect. My jaw was locked, the muscles in my neck straining against my collar. I pushed the gas pedal down harder, wanting nothing more than distance between me and that poisoned house. Then, like a blow to the chest, my mind yanked me somewhere else entirely. I wasn't in my freezing truck anymore, I was standing in a stark white hospital room, 15 years in the past. The smell of antiseptic and bleached sheets filled my lungs. A heart monitor ticked along slowly, painfully. I looked down and saw my mother's thin, bruised hand gripping the crisp sleeve of my brand-new Navy uniform. Her skin was almost translucent, her veins tracing a map of a life spent working double shifts at a textile mill so her 2 daughters would never go hungry. She never complained, never asked for anything back. And now she was dying in a county hospital because she'd refused to spend a dime on her own checkups, choosing instead to put every spare cent toward our lunches and winter coats. Her eyes, clouded by medication, were full of a fear so raw it seeped straight into me. She wasn't looking at my rank. She wasn't asking me to be brave for my country or to make it home from whatever wars awaited. Instead, she gave me one mission, a single order that would shape the rest of my adult life like an invisible set of chains. Her breathing was ragged, a horrible rattle deep in her chest, but her last words came out clear and absolute: "Look after your sister. She's still so young." Then her grip tightened once, a last surge of strength, before her hand went completely still. That sentence became my personal code of honor. For the next 15 years I followed it without question. Driving through the snow, I relived the brutal deployments I'd endured to keep that promise, eating tasteless field rations on a heaving carrier deck in the middle of a typhoon, my stomach churning from the waves and from guilt over being so far from a sister who supposedly needed me. I remembered freezing night watches in waters crawling with pirates, volunteering for every dangerous mission just for the extra pay, because my sister's demands never stopped growing. The calls always came at 3 in the morning my time, her voice laced with rehearsed urgency: "Tommy needs braces, Emma's school raised its fees, the roof is leaking and the contractor wants payment up front." And every dollar of that hazard pay, every cent I'd bled for, went straight back home without me ever asking a single question. It paid for her endless collection of designer bags, her tropical getaways to resorts I'd never set foot in, the Porsche she parked in the driveway like a trophy, the whole manufactured image of a self-made life she broadcast to thousands of followers. She lived like royalty in her mansion, curating a fake empire online, while I slept on a steel bunk in a floating box, cut off from the rest of the world. My loyalty, given blindly, had created a monster. And tonight that monster had finally shown its true face. The memory broke apart as I pulled into my dark, snow-covered driveway just before sunrise. My house sat silent, a sharp contrast to the gaudy holiday lights still glowing at the mansion I'd just left. I didn't bother pulling off my boots. I walked straight to my study, the air inside cold and still. Dropping to one knee, I spun the dial on my old military safe until the lock gave way with a heavy click. Inside there were no medals, no citations, nothing military about it at all, just meticulous financial records, kept purely out of habit. Every receipt logged. Every transfer recorded. Every lie, unknowingly documented. I pulled out the thick stack of bank statements and dropped them onto my desk, the weight of them feeling like 15 years of betrayal made physical. I ran my finger down the columns, each line a record of my own blind devotion. Tuition payments to a private school charging $40,000 a year for an education my sister called non-negotiable, despite never finishing community college herself. Deposits on a luxury apartment she used only as a backdrop for her social media, visiting twice a month to shoot content while I covered the full rent on an empty unit. Massive car payments for vehicles I never once sat in. Emergency bailouts that always conveniently lined up with product launches or resort deadlines, each one paired with the same tearful voicemail about a sick child or a broken furnace. One call from 8 years back came back to me with painful clarity. I'd just finished a grueling 3-day watch rotation in a tense stretch of the South China Sea, my eyes burning from staring at radar screens, my uniform soaked with sweat. The satellite phone rang in the dead of night, and my sister's voice came through, thick with manufactured panic. Tommy was in the emergency room with a dangerous fever, she said, and she couldn't cover the bill. I wired $5,000 without a second thought. 2 weeks later, on a rare bit of shore leave, I scrolled past a photo she'd posted that same day, lounging by a pool at a 5-star resort in Cancun, cocktail in hand, captioned with hashtags about being blessed and living her best life. Tommy had never gone anywhere near a hospital. The fever was invented. That $5,000 had bought her a vacation. Each entry on that desk felt like another knife in my back. I opened my laptop, the harsh blue glow lighting up my tired face, and began typing out the final numbers on a master spreadsheet, tallying every dollar I'd bled for to keep her fake life afloat since our mother died. The totals kept climbing: combat pay, hazard bonuses, tax-free deployment income, money that could have gone into savings, all of it funneled into her open hands instead. The final figure lit up the screen in stark black digits: $1,150,000. The scale of it hit me like a punch to the chest. I sank back in my chair, the leather groaning. 1.15 million. That number represented every sleepless night on a rolling ship deck, every holiday I missed, every birthday spent alone with a cup of instant coffee while she popped champagne in a ballroom I'd paid for. The blind sense of duty that had chained me to my mother's final words died right there. It simply evaporated, replaced by something colder, sharper. I reached up and wiped away a single tear that had escaped despite myself. Whatever grief lingered hardened instantly into pure resolve. The soft, forgiving version of me was gone. What remained was calculating the most effective way to cut off the damage. I picked up my secure phone and began setting the wheels of my plan into motion. Not long after that holiday, everyone went back to their ordinary routines. I went back to war. Walking into my naval office, I was met with the familiar order of military life: sharp salutes, crisp uniforms, disciplined structure, a welcome contrast to the entitled chaos I'd just left behind. I sat at my desk, the cold metal grounding me, and pushed my personal phone to the far edge where I wouldn't have to look at it. Instead, I picked up the secure line connected to the bank's executive branch. I wasn't a grieving sister trying to buy peace anymore. I was an officer identifying a threat and neutralizing it. I took a breath, locked away every trace of sympathy, and gave the order. Speaking with total, measured control, I bypassed the usual channels and told the representative to cancel every automatic transfer immediately. Freeze every secondary card. Cut all accounts tied to my sister completely. No overdraft exceptions, no grace period, no warnings. As the representative worked through my instructions, another memory surfaced, my sister's voice 3 years earlier, insisting she needed more money for the kids' private school tuition, while at the very same time booking a first-class ticket to the Bahamas with those same funds. She'd lied about her children's needs to fund a vacation. That memory burned away the last trace of hesitation I had left. I hung up the phone, the click echoing through my office like a door sealing shut. The financial lifeline was cut. The trap was set. Meanwhile, completely unaware of what had just happened, my sister was strolling through an upscale mall, arms loaded with shopping bags from a spending spree, walking with the confident stride of someone used to being catered to. She flashed her practiced smile at the boutique staff and swiped her card. A sharp error tone rang out, cutting through the soft music. The cashier glanced at the screen, then back at her, hoping it would resolve itself. It didn't. She cleared her throat and quietly explained the card had been declined. The word hung there like a slap. My sister's smile disappeared, replaced by confusion she'd never experienced in a checkout line before. She snapped the card back, insisting the machine was broken, and tried another. Declined. Then another. Declined. People nearby began whispering. The staff started returning the merchandise to the shelves as her carefully built image crumbled in front of a room full of strangers. Back in my office, my personal phone began buzzing violently on the desk. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice came through frantic, somewhere between fury and panic. Catherine, what's wrong with the bank? All my cards are frozen, fix this right now, I'm stuck at the mall. I leaned back and watched the gray waves crash against the base's seawall outside my window. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the calm precision of someone who had already made peace with the decision. There's no error, Olivia. The support has officially ended. Happy New Year. Time to stand on your own. I ended the call and blocked her number immediately. I set the phone down and returned to my work. The line was dead. The conflict had begun. Just hours after the accounts were frozen, they showed up at my gates. My aide, Lieutenant Vance, came into my office with concern written across his face. 2 civilians were causing a scene at the entrance, yelling at the guards, demanding to see me. The sentries wanted permission to intervene. I stood, put on my jacket, straightened every button, and walked out across the frozen tarmac toward the checkpoint. A memory hit me on the way, them showing up uninvited at my apartment years earlier, banging on my door late at night demanding rent for a lease I hadn't even known they'd signed. My brother-in-law had put his muddy shoes on my furniture and criticized it while my sister went through my mail looking for bank statements. They'd never respected my boundaries. But this time they'd walked onto federal property, where my word wasn't a suggestion, it was law. The moment I stepped past the barricade, my sister lunged forward, her face contorted with anger, her coat whipping in the wind. She launched straight into guilt, screaming about how humiliated she was, how Mom told me to take care of her, how I was abandoning family during the holidays. My brother-in-law puffed his chest out and demanded I fix the bank error, pointing a finger at me as though he had any standing on military ground. I stood still, letting them exhaust themselves the way I'd let incoming fire pass. When they finally paused for breath, I reached into my coat and pulled out the thick stack of audited statements. I slammed them down onto the hood of their car with enough force to make them both flinch. $1,150,000, I said, low and even. That's what I paid to fund your fantasy. Mom asked me to help my sister get an education, not bankroll a princess and her husband for 15 years. My sister's mouth fell open, her eyes darting between me and the armed guards watching in silence. I stepped closer, my voice stripped of any warmth. Family isn't something you get to exploit. I gave them 10 seconds to leave the property or be arrested for trespassing on federal land. The guards stepped forward in unison. All the arrogance drained from my sister's face, replaced by real fear. They scrambled to their car, my brother-in-law dropping his keys twice in the snow before finally peeling away. Weeks passed in total silence, and then the holiday bills caught up to them like an avalanche. Without my money propping them up, their accounts went deep into the red almost overnight. From the deck of my ship during a classified deployment, I stared out at the black ocean and thought of every holiday I'd spent freezing on watch, eating packaged food while other sailors video called their families. Also, my sister could host lavish parties and post them online. Now the roles had reversed. Vance kept me updated through encrypted messages, furious calls from creditors, stacks of red-stamped notices piling up. The bubble I'd financed for 15 years had finally burst. They were drowning in debt they'd created themselves, and I'd cut the rope. The first casualty was her prized Porsche. A tow truck arrived on a Tuesday morning and hauled it away while she stood on the lawn screaming threats at the driver, who calmly handed her a repossession notice and drove off. At home, things grew desperate. My brother-in-law, stripped of his fake executive persona, realized his modest office salary couldn't cover groceries, let alone the mortgage. He swallowed his pride and took a cashier job at the local grocery store, trading his tailored suits for a cheap uniform. On his first day, his manager handed him a shovel and told him to clear the entrance. He spent the morning shoveling slush, his soft hands blistering in the cold, his first real taste of physical labor. Through it all, I stayed completely silent, letting Vance's reports come in like mission briefings. I called it the starvation strategy, a harsh but necessary approach meant to let them sit in the consequences they'd built until they finally broke. Reading about my brother-in-law shoveling snow for minimum wage, the same man who'd once mocked my career at that Christmas table, I felt a flicker of guilt. But I shut it down. I knew that if I stepped in now, even briefly, their sense of entitlement would never truly heal. They needed to feel it all the way through. When I finally returned from my deployment, I expected the silence to have taught them something. Instead, Vance told me they'd launched a counterattack that made my blood boil worse than that Christmas dinner ever had. My sister had posted an emotional essay online about her worst holiday ever, painting me as a heartless military tyrant who'd frozen a struggling family's accounts out of spite, letting innocent kids go hungry, hoarding our mother's inheritance, and threatening her with armed soldiers. Every claim was a carefully twisted half-truth. It spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and soon people who'd never met me were calling me a monster. It was the exact same manipulation she'd used since childhood, playing the victim to hide her own behavior, and people believed it completely. The head of the local parents' association, a woman named Linda Sterling who loved drama almost as much as my sister loved handbags, took the story and ran with it, branding me cruel and abusive in the community newsletter. Reading her post, I flashed back to being 12 years old, watching my sister fake tears after breaking our mother's favorite vase while trying to steal cookies, blaming me for hitting her when I never had. Our mother had slapped me without asking a single question, and my sister smirked behind her back. Decades later, it was the same playbook, just with a bigger audience. I didn't respond online. I didn't get into arguments with strangers. Instead, I planned something direct. I walked into the neighborhood's New Year gathering in my full dress uniform, medals polished, and the room fell silent as I moved through the crowd. Linda stood at the front, reading aloud from a printout of my sister's story like it was gospel. I walked straight up, said nothing, and dropped my certified financial statements on her table, scattering her papers. I read off every figure out loud: tuition, deposits, car payments, vacations, every dollar I'd spent over 15 years, slow and clear enough for the whole room to hear. Linda went pale as she scanned the verified documents, realizing she'd defended someone who had lied to her completely. Then, From the back of the room, a man I'd quietly invited stepped forward, James Mitchell, manager of the dealership that had financed the Porsche. Without hesitation, he announced to the room that the car had been entirely backed by me, and that my sister had missed 3 payments the moment my money stopped. The room erupted into stunned murmurs. My sister's carefully built story fell apart instantly. She stood frozen in the back, pale and shaking. I stepped forward and told her plainly that her fabricated image was finished, that she had nothing left to hide behind. The crowd turned away from her in disgust, and Linda left without saying another word, her credibility gone along with my sister's. Not long after that public collapse, the final blow arrived, a 30-day foreclosure notice taped to the front door of the mansion, tearing the paint as it was pressed into place. Inside, conditions had deteriorated. The heat had been shut off for unpaid bills, water service barely hanging on. The extravagant Christmas tree from that fateful dinner sat dead and shedding needles onto an expensive rug, ornaments still hanging as though nothing had changed, a fitting symbol of a life rotting from within while they froze in the dark. The pressure fractured their marriage. Blame flew between them nightly. The first night without heat, they slept in coats, piling blankets on the kids while a heavy silence settled between the adults. Within weeks, that silence turned into screaming matches loud enough that neighbors called the police twice. My brother-in-law accused her of reckless spending while staring at a closet full of clothes they couldn't eat. She accused him of failing to provide, throwing his low wages in his face. He fired back the truth, that none of their lifestyle had ever been his money, it had all been mine, and she'd never earned any of it. She slapped him hard enough to leave a mark and told him he was less of a man than a school janitor. He grabbed a thin jacket and walked out, slamming the door so hard the foreclosure notice fluttered off it. Upstairs, the children listened through the walls. Sitting in my own warm, secure home, reading Vance's updates, I thought about all the years I'd shielded them from consequences, paying every bill before penalties hit, solving every crisis with a wire transfer, absorbing every overspend without complaint. I'd been their safety net for so long, and they repaid it by calling me a broke, pathetic soldier at their own dinner table. I understood now that the pain they were living through was the most important lesson they'd ever get. I had to let it burn all the way through. Driving home late one night, I parked across from the grocery store and watched through the frosted window as my brother-in-law counted change at the register, exhausted and hollow. A customer tossed a crumpled receipt at him, and he picked it up without a word. My chest ached, not for the adults who'd earned this outcome, but for Tommy and Emma, who hadn't asked for any of it. They hadn't insulted me or spent my paycheck. They were innocent casualties in a fight they never started. I reached out to Vance through our secure channel and had him quietly deliver winter coats, boots, and nutritious food to the kids at their school, with strict instructions to keep the donor anonymous. No note, no trace back to me. I made sure they never suffered physically, even while I let their parents face the full weight of what they'd done. It was the one compromise I allowed myself. Even after securing the children's basic needs, I held firm on cutting off all contact with my sister and her husband. They needed to hit bottom completely, to feel the terror of losing everything they believed they were owed. I sat in my truck some nights, engine idling, watching in silence as my brother-in-law finished his shift, zipped up a jacket far too thin for the cold, and walked to the bus stop, his car long gone. A man who once mocked my pension now stood shivering, praying for a bus to come before his hands went numb. I waited for the moment their pride would finally give out completely. During a brutal late-night storm, my doorbell rang over and over, urgent and desperate. I set down the worn paperback I'd carried through 3 deployments and opened the door. My brother-in-law stood there soaked through in his grocery store uniform, shivering, his name tag still pinned crookedly to his chest. In his hand was a small plastic bag holding a half-eaten sleeve of crackers and a bruised apple, clearly the only food he'd had that day. The man who had once laughed at my career, who had mocked my pension at my own table, stood completely broken. He cried openly, his tears mixing with melting snow. He didn't try to explain himself away or twist the story. He spoke only for himself. "I was a coward, Catherine," he said. "I failed to protect my own kids because I was too weak to earn a living on my own. Please, we have nothing left. We're starving." He admitted he'd known exactly what my sister had been doing, that he'd heard her invent emergencies to pull money from me and said nothing because the comfort was too easy to give up. He admitted he'd heard her laughing about how easily I'd been fooled, and instead of stopping her, he'd poured another glass of wine paid for with my money. I listened without saying a word, arms crossed, letting his apology dissolve into the cold air without offering him comfort. I watched his tears freeze on my doormat. Then I stepped aside and let him into the hallway, nothing more. No food, no warmth, no embrace. He sat quietly by the door and waited. The next morning, the person truly responsible for it all arrived. My sister walked slowly up my driveway, barely recognizable. Gone was the makeup, the designer bags, the polished hair, the arrogance. She was hollow and exhausted, her coat, the same one from the repossession, stained and worn thin. She dropped to her knees in the snow on my porch, sobbing, grabbing at my uniform and begging me to save her children from homelessness. "Please, Catherine, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't let them take the house. I'll do anything," she wept, desperate for the sister who used to rescue her without question. She looked up at me, her face raw, and I could see the exact moment she realized her tears no longer worked on me. The version of me who would have crumbled at her first sob was gone. I looked down at the woman who had drained me financially for 15 years and didn't flinch. I pried her hands off my uniform and stepped back, holding the composure of someone who had made her decision long before this moment. I pulled a legal document from my coat, one I'd had prepared weeks earlier, anticipating exactly this. "These are the terms," I said, my voice flat. I brought them inside to hear the conditions. They sat side by side on my couch, tracking snow across the floor, neither able to look at me. I laid out the terms plainly. First, I would set up an independent fund for the children's education and medical needs, but every other expense, mortgage, car, bills, would come from their own income from that point forward. Not another cent from me. Then I turned to my sister. "Second, you'll record a public video retracting your lies, apologizing to me, and admitting to 15 years of taking advantage of my income." She gasped, horrified at the thought of that kind of public exposure, but there was nothing left for her to say. She looked to her husband, who only stared at the floor. She had no choice but to accept. The morning of the bank's final deadline arrived, less than a day before the sheriff would carry out the eviction. The tension in my living room was suffocating. My sister and her husband sat at the table, hands trembling, as she picked up the pen and read through the legal language stripping her of any further access to my money. The weight of total defeat settled over her as she signed, her hand shaking, the ink wobbling across the page, legally committing herself to a life of real independence. No more invented emergencies, no more fake tuition bills, no more vacations disguised as hospital visits. Her husband signed right after, his signature barely legible. In under 10 seconds, they'd formally ended an arrangement that had eaten 15 years of my life and well over $1 million of my earnings. After checking every signature and date, I pulled out my checkbook, its leather cover worn smooth from years of careful use. I wrote out exactly what was needed to stop the foreclosure, not a cent more. I tore the check free and set it on the table, the sound sharp in the silence, and both of them flinched. "This is the last time I bail this family out," I said, my voice final. That sentence erased whatever entitlement they had left. They stared at the wet ink, understanding that the well had run completely dry. If they ever fell behind again, I would let the house go without hesitation. It wasn't a threat, it was simply the truth. I stood over my sister as she picked up her phone and turned on the camera. The recording light blinked on. She didn't just cry, she confessed. "I lied to everyone," she said into the lens. I lived off my sister's military income for 15 years to fund a life that wasn't real. She's not the villain here. I was the one taking advantage. I'm truly sorry for everything I said about her. Her voice cracked on the last few words, the camera shaking in her unsteady hands, but every word was recorded. The false narrative was gone for good. The relief I felt was complete. Time moved on, slowly carrying away the wreckage of the past. That harsh winter eventually gave way to a warm, bright Easter Sunday. Months had passed since they'd signed those terms in my living room. The tension between us had softened into something like cautious respect. We gathered at their house for a simple spring dinner, and the atmosphere was nothing like that toxic Christmas months before. The house felt lighter, as if something dark had finally lifted. We weren't a commanding officer and her captives anymore. We were slowly, carefully becoming a family again. My brother-in-law stood in the kitchen, changed completely. Gone were the expensive suits bought with money that wasn't his. He was now a shift supervisor at the grocery store, promoted after months of showing up early and staying late without complaint. His first real paycheck stub hung framed on the fridge beside the kids' drawings, a small, quiet symbol that said more than any apology could. His hands, once soft, were now calloused from honest work, and his handshake at the door was firm and unashamed. My sister, without a trace of her old glamour, was cooking a simple meal with real care, a small burn mark on her thumb from the oven. She'd taken a part-time job at a dental office and was studying in the evenings for a certification. Her old designer wardrobe had been sold off, the money going straight to overdue bills. She didn't reach for her phone once to photograph the food or stage the table. The simple pot roast and homemade rolls tasted better than any catered meal ever had. It tasted honest. The kids ran into the room, filling the house with laughter that had been missing far too long. Tommy, 12 now, pulled out my chair before sitting down himself, something his father had clearly taught him. He'd grown taller, his face thinner but his eyes clear and steady. He told me quietly that he was making straight A's and had joined the track team, that he wanted to earn things for himself from now on. I nodded, and he sat up a little straighter. My niece Emma came running up to me, eyes full of genuine admiration. She didn't ask for a toy or a shopping trip. She reached out and gently touched the ribbons on my uniform, tracing each one, finally understanding what they represented, what it had taken to save this family from itself. "Aunt Catherine, I'm so proud of you," she whispered, wrapping her arms around my waist. I smiled, a real smile, the first one that had reached my eyes since before that Christmas dinner. I rested my hand on her head and held her there for a long moment, feeling the last of the cold finally start to thaw inside me after 15 years of carrying that weight alone. The heavy burden I'd carried for so long finally lifted, dissolving into the warm spring air. Looking around at my transformed family, a man who'd found dignity in honest work, a sister who'd learned the real value of a meal she'd cooked herself, children who were laughing not because of gifts but because their parents were finally present without the shouting, I understood something clearly. I hadn't destroyed my family with that hard line I'd drawn. I'd saved them from themselves. By holding firm, I'd broken the cycle of entitlement that had been eating them alive. My mother's final wish had finally been honored the way she truly meant it. She hadn't asked me to fund someone else's fantasy, she'd asked me to take care of my sister. And sometimes taking care of someone means making them stand on their own, even when they beg you not to. I stood there in the warm sunlight coming through the window, feeling its heat on my face, knowing I'd built something lasting, real strength, real respect, real independence for all of us. The long winter was finally over. The healing was complete. If this story about turning a painful family betrayal into real healing meant something to you, feel free to like and subscribe for more stories like it. And if you've ever had to stand up to a manipulative family member yourself, share your story in the comments.